Il Trovatore, music by Verdi, words by Camarano, Rome, 1853, London, 1855, New York, 1855. It is merely a parrot cry that insists on the unique absurdity of the plot of Il Trovatore, compared with that of many another opera, say Robert Le Diable or Dinora. The libretto is a masterpiece of sane lucidity and dramatic inevitableness. It is true that you cannot expect to understand Trovatore on the first visit without little previous study of the book, but that is no uncommon case. What about Figaro? What about The Ring? No. As sheer melodrama, the plot of the troubadour or the gypsy's vengeance is good and strong. We must admit that the statement is interesting but tough, as Huckleberry Finn remarked of a very different work. The chief difficulty in keeping hold of the thread of the drama in performance lies in the fact that so much that is necessary for us to follow is packed into a couple of narratives, one by quite a subordinate character, and these are poured out in a flow of such fascinating melody that our attention is distracted from their logical contents. Yet the story of Il Trovatore must be mastered if we would properly enjoy the music, which is far more closely wedded to the dramatic development than is generally supposed. Of course, when we find the soprano labeled Leonora, the tenor Manrico, the old seneschal Ferrando, and the confidant Inez, we prepare at once for a drama of incident rather than of character. Nevertheless, the play contains one of the strongest personalities in the whole of opera, the aged gypsy Azucena, a true figure of tragedy and one of Verdi's greatest triumphs in musical characterization. Many years before the opening of the drama, Azucena had seen her mother burned to the stake on a charge of having, by witchcraft, caused the illness of one of the Count di Luna's infant sons. The girl, herself a mother, had, in her frenzy of grief and hate, stolen the sickly child and flung it on to the still, flaming pyre in which her mother had just perished. Such, at least, was her intention, but actually, it was her own child whom, in the blindness of her rage, she had snatched from the cradle where the two infants slept side by side, and had sent to such an awful death. So far her efforts of revenge have recoiled upon herself. But the stolen child remains in her hands. She flies with him to the mountains of Biscaglia, her old home, where she brings him up as her son, to be used as the instrument of her vengeance in the future. When the play opens, the old Count di Luna has long been dead, and his son, succeeding, imagines himself the last of his race. Meanwhile, fate and Azucena have so contrived that Manrico, the Count's unexpected brother, had become his bitter opponent in feudal warfare and his rival in love. At the court of the Princess of Aragon, to which the Count is attached, dwells the lovely Leonora, whom he designs to marry. She, however, has been captivated by the gallant figure of Manrico, the troubadour, famous alike for song and knightly prowess, at whose triumph in the tournament she has herself assisted. As Manrico is in the service of the Prince of Biscaglia, the enemy of the Count, the two brothers are in perpetual conflict and from a double motive. Manrico at last succeeds in carrying Leonora off to his own castle, where he is just about to lead her to the altar, when the news arrives that Azucena, his supposed mother, has fallen into the Count's hands and has been condemned to the flames. He rushes off to her rescue, only to be captured by the Count's men and thrown into prison. Leonora returns to the Count and offers to yield to his wishes if he will set Manrico free. But in order to escape from her promise, she takes poison and dies in the arms of her true love. The Count, baffled and furious, orders Manrico to instant death by fire. As the flames of the pyre in the castle leap high around the victim and throw their glare on the dungeon walls, the Count drags Azucena to the iron grating of the cell. "See," he cries, "that is thy son." "Nay," comes the awful answer, "that is thy brother." The gypsy's revenge is accomplished. She falls dead at the Count di Luna's feet. Act 1. Terraces and gardens of the castle of Aliaferia, where Leonora and the Count di Luna both reside, in attendance on the court of Aragon. A moonlit night with flying clouds. Soldiers are on guard to prevent the expected intrusion of the troubadour, whose nocturnal serenades of late have made the Count uneasy. Ferrando, an old retainer, tells once again the old story of the mysterious fate of the Count's infant brother, the gypsy mother's fiery death, and the escape of the daughter. Even now, some malevolent influence lingers around the place. The spirit of the old witch has been seen by many in the form of a gigantic owl, fluttering round the battlements and shrieking horribly at the dead of the night. The midnight bell now sounds, and Ferrando and his listeners retire. In this short but significant scene, Verdi begins at once to batter our ears with his two persistent dance rhythms. Ferrando's long narration, Abbieta Zingara, is in mazurka form, while the reference to the spectral owl, Sull'orlo dei tetti, in which the chorus join, has the effect of a tarantella, though written in 3/4 time. Nevertheless, these materials, if properly handled on the stage as well as in the orchestra, produce an undeniable, if crude, effect of mystery and terror. Now Leonora, in white satin and attended by Inez, her confidante, floats down the marble steps into the moonlit garden and soon transports us to a region where moonlit and music and feeling are one. She expects her troubadour, Manrico. Meanwhile, Inez must have the story of their first meeting at the tourney and of his serenades beneath her window. Her solo, Tasea la notte placida, is the first of the many exquisite melodies in this opera which exalt so beautifully the spirit of the early days of the Romantic movement, as expressed in Byron, Miss Radcliffe, and certain of the tales of Edgar Allan Poe. Inez warns her against cherishing so perilous a flame, to which the soprano replies in the inevitable balletta, which had to follow the andante according to the operatic formula of the time. They retire to Leonora's apartments, beneath the windows of which the enamored Count di Luna now appears. He cannot sleep for love of Leonora, whose heart he hopes this very hour to move to pity. Barely has he time for his short recitative when a distant harp is heard, preluding to a thrilling melody such as only a troubadour could sing, Deserta sulla terra. Leonora too has heard it, and comes rushing on to the scene just as Manrico enters. Confused by the uncertain light, she throws herself most unfortunately into the arms of the Count, to Manrico's natural indignation. This seems a quite unnecessary complication, which merely serves to perplex the spectator. A few bars, however, suffice to put the matter right, and the two lovers enjoy a whole page of mutual rapture before the Count finds voice to interrupt them. In a tempestuous allegro assai mosso agitatissimo di geloso amor spezzato, he pours out his furious jealousy and demands Manrico's blood. The troubadour's haughty defiance and the shrill pleadings of Leonora make up a perfect whirlwind of a trio which lasts to the end of the act, leaving, if not the singers exhausted, the audience breathless with excitement. Leonora falls senseless to the ground, while tenor and baritone prepare for what promises to be a mortal combat. Such is the first act, effective, swift, and simple. We have already had a feast of melody in three of the composer's most characteristic manners: the true romantic beauty of Leonora's opening solo and Manrico's song behind the scenes, the rather incongruous dance tunes of Ferrando's legend, and the amazing, almost brutal energy of the Count's jealous outburst in the concluding trio. Yet each of these models will be improved upon as the opera proceeds. Act 2, Scene 1. We are now to make the acquaintance of the one great personage of the play, the gypsy Azucena. The scene is a gypsy encampment. The men are busy at the forge, the maidens dancing to their tinkling tambourines. All is life and gaiety, musically crude and highly colored. The famous anvil chorus, to which the men beat time with their blacksmith's hammers, runs its noisy course. The song, the dancing cease, to be succeeded by music of a very different order. Azucena has been cowering over a fire of logs, seeing, hearing, nothing of what goes on around her, sunk in her brooding sorrow, bowed and withered, not so much by age as the awful experience of her girlhood. She lives for one thing only: revenge. It is true she has a mother's love for Manrico, whom she has reared from infancy to manhood, but even him she would sacrifice on the altar of her vengeance. Now she rises, a dark, menacing figure, under the influence of some terrible emotions. Without prelude or participation, she begins her air stride, La Vampa, Azucena's fire song, would be its best description. Softly at first, as if her reverie by the campfire had not been broken, she paints the scene of her mother's awful fate. She sees her in rags, barefoot, bareheaded, her gray hair fallen about her shoulders, dragged to the stake amid the jeers and howls of the pitiless mob. The first part of the song is given with a tense and ominous quiet. But as the fires kindled at the stake and the flames leap high around the victim, so does the voice gather strength and rise to a cry of agony. By the end of the second verse, Azucena is exhausted and has just sufficient strength for the mi vendica, which has her mother's last utterance and is her own life's own one object. The gypsies are now on the move, but Azucena remains to explain to Manrico the meaning of her appeal for vengeance. In what is musically one of the finest numbers of the opera, she describes how her mother, in her death agony, bequeathed to her daughter the awful duty of revenge. She then goes on to reveal her own dreadful secret, how having stolen the old Count de Luna's son, intending to throw him into the flames, she finds that in her blind fury she has sacrificed her own child instead. Here, it must be noted, we have the weakest link in the dramatic chain. Manrico draws the only possible conclusion from Azucena's narrative, that as she never had more than one child, he cannot be her son. Her only reply to his challenge is that, in her excitement, she has told the tale amiss. Yes, he is her son. Has she not been to him the tenderest of mothers? So it is he who must take up her cause and the task of vengeance imposed upon her. mi vendica, she reiterates. The Count must be made to suffer for his father's crime. She urges Manrico to a keener sense of his duty. Did he not lately, when the Count was in his power, refrain from his advantage? What moved him to act thus? Manrico's reply is one of the curiosities of the opera, a point which probably very few have noticed. His air, mal reggendo, is a striking melody, yet of the vaguest significance, and their general attitude is to accept it, without further question, as one of those haunting tunes with which Verdi, at this period, could scarcely help plastering his score. The words, however, are full of quite unexpected interest. They relate how Manrico, when the Count lay prostrate at his feet, and his sword was poised for the fatal blow, he was turned from his purpose by a voice from heaven saying to him, "Forbear to strike." The subtle touch of psychology, suggesting a secret affinity between the two brothers, is rather surprising in an opera of the period and the caliber of Il Trovatore. Just as Azucena is spurring him on to great ruthlessness in the future, a messenger arrives with the tidings that his presence is needed in two places. The Prince of Biscaglia has appointed him to the defense of a certain fortress, and Leonora, deceived by a false report of his death, is on the eve of entering a convent, there to take the veil. No need now to urge the troubadour to action. He is on fire to be gone. But Azucena becomes all tenderness and apprehension. She cannot bear to let him go, and it is only after a lengthy duet that he succeeds in tearing himself away. Azucena's music, all through the scene, is worthy of the closest attention. It shows an advance in the direction of music drama, beyond anything yet achieved in Italian opera. The air, Stride la Vampa, which may be regarded as the central point of interest in the opera, is treated in a strikingly original manner. Without any recitative to introduce it, the usual "Where am I? Oh, day of horror," or "Well, I will tell you," it cuts straight into the scene of noisy gaiety with compelling effect. The melody is given to the orchestra later on, quite in the Wagnerian manner, and is introduced with still greater point into the prison scene at the end. But far finer music is to be found in the scena that follows, Condotta era alla Inceppi, in which Azucena reconstructs the tragedy of her mother's death and her own fatal mistake. Here, the vocal phrases, broad and melodious as they are, serve admirably to conduct the narrative, while the independent figures in the orchestra suggest most vividly the tragic idea of the aged gypsy dragging herself wearily through life under a burden too great for her to bear. The long, low notes of the concluding bars, "Sul capo mio le chiome sento drizzarsi ancor," sung in the contralto's deepest tones, leave an impression of hopeless misery not easily forgotten. Scene 2. Moonlight in the convent grounds. The Count, who has heard of Leonora's intention of retiring from the world, is determined to prevent her. He has come, with his retainers, just in time. He sings of his passion in the famous Il Ballen del suo sorriso, which, under the title of The Tempest of the Heart, was the delight or torment of generations of Victorians. The convent bell is heard, and a chanted chorale. The Count's men stealthily prepare for action. From the chapel come the nuns in procession to receive Leonora, who arrives attended by Ines. Just as the convent gates are about to close on her forever, the Count steps forward to claim her, and at the same moment Manrico and his men arrive with a similar purpose. Leonora flies to the arms of her lover, whom she has supposed to be dead. Her song of ecstasy, Teggio e posso crederlo, permits the most interesting material for the finale, in which the chorus of soldiers, retainers, and religious lend but feeble support. It is made plain, however, that Manrico's party is the stronger, and Leonora passes without a struggle into his possession. The heroine is allowed to end the scene sola, with a 4-bar repetition of the loveliest phrases of her song of ecstasy. Act 3, Scene 1. An armed camp near the fortress of Castellor in the Bissalia territory. The Count is besieging the castle to which Manrico has brought Leonora. The soldiers' chorus with which the scene opens is, of all such compositions, perhaps the most blatant and banal, though ample amends will soon be made. The Count enters, deploring his loss, and threatening swift revenge on his rival. On the morrow Castellor shall fall, and Leonora shall be his. A tumult in the orchestra heralds the noisy entrance of a band of soldiers, dragging in the unhappy Azucena, on whom they have just laid hands. To the Count and old Ferrando, a gypsy is always an object of suspicion. The family legend is never forgotten. Azucena, on being questioned, admits she is from Biscaglia, a hostile territory. On closer scrutiny, Ferrando discovers, or decides, that she is the very gypsy who stole the Count's infant brother. The Count, of course, accepts his word, and when Azucena in her despair cries out, "Manrico, my son, what art thou not here to help me?" The discovery that the mother of his rival is in his hands rouses him to greater fury. Azucena must die the fiery death. The old woman makes a brave struggle for freedom, but is bound fast and dragged away, calling down the curse of heaven on the Count and her tormentors. In this short but very dramatic scene, Azucena's music again creates the right atmosphere, that of the weary, desolate woman driven on her doom. In spite of its set, monotonous rhythm, the solo Giorni poveri vivea has a somber sense of tragedy, as have also the rest of her broken phrases, while the frenzied vigor of her chorus, De rallentate barbari, seems almost to break its formal fetters, and works up the finale to a perfectly appropriate climax. Scene 2. This scene, which passes inside the fortress of Castellor, consists virtually but of 2 solos, one of which is among the loveliest, the other the most sensational in the entire opera. The lovers are about to be joined in marriage, but even now Leonora cannot quite shake off her fears of the dangers that surround them. Manrico bids his bride put all her trust in love, whether on earth or on heaven. No power can separate them. They are eternally united. This is the meaning of the suave and finely developed air Assi, ben mio, which for sheer melodic beauty Verdi himself has rarely surpassed. This is followed by the sound of the organ, and a most effective passage for the two voices, which is too often omitted. They are on their way to the chapel when a breathless messenger breaks in on them with the dreadful tidings that Azucena has been captured by the Count de Luna's men and is in instant danger of being burnt at the stake. There's not a moment to be lost. Manrico takes leave of his weeping bride and expresses his passionate desire for his foster mother's release in the famous Di Quella Pira, which calls for robust vocal cords and a more heroic style of delivery than any other tenor solo in the whole of Italian opera. For the wholly unnecessary parade of the high C, which is now universally expected at the end of the second verse, the vanity of tenors, and not Verdi, is responsible. He finishes the scene with the aid of a male chorus, an arrangement in every way more satisfactory. Act 4. Even if Il Trovatore should disappear from the repertoire, it seems probable that the last act would still survive. It is a compact masterpiece, in which lyric beauty and dramatic significance are closely blended, and 70 years of continuous popularity have failed to dispel, or even diminish, its glamour of romance. Scene 1. Outside the castle of Aliaferia, Manrico, in his attempt to rescue Azucena, has himself been taken prisoner. He and his foster mother lie in the same dungeon awaiting execution. Leonora, accompanied by one of Manrico's men from Castellor, is here. She has come inspired by one fixed purpose: to save the troubadour's life, even at the cost of her own. To the Count she will give her promise, if necessary, but herself, never. Here, she says, raising the hand on which is a ring which conceals a deadly poison, here is my sure protection. Turning toward the tower in which she knows Manrico to be confined, she pours forth her soul in a gush of warm and tender melody. D'amor sull'ali rosee far surpasses even her first air, Tacea la notte, as an example of romantic beauty. Hardly is it finished when the choir in the chapel are heard chanting the Miserere, the penitential psalm which implores mercy for the parting soul. Have mercy, O Lord, on the souls of them that are so soon to leave this world. Let them not fall into the pit of darkness. It is this simple chorus which has given the scene the popular name of the Miserere, now often misapplied to the great tenor solo which is to follow. All Leonora's terrors are aroused by these funereal sounds. In the poignant, broken phrases which follow, we may hear her sobs and count the very beatings of her heart. Now from the tower floats down Manrico's pathetic farewell to life, and Leonora, che la morte, short, simple, and of flawless outline, it is probably the nearest approach to an immortal melody that is to be found in Italian opera. Of rare intrinsic beauty, its effect on the stage is prepared and heightened by every circumstance. With the initial advantage of being sung by an invisible tenor, its broad phrases in the major key, breaking in upon the heart-rending sobs of the heroine, come as a complete surprise, and seem to lend a touch of resignation, if not of hope, even to her despair, while it gains enormously by mingling with Leonora's fervent responses and the somber strains of the religious choir. But even removed from its setting, and divested of all these advantages, sung in the concert room or played on a barrel organ, the melody of Ah, che la morte never fails to cast its spell upon those who hear it. It seems to be made of the same imperishable stuff as Gluck's Che farò senza Euridice and Handel's Largo in G. The Count enters, and in the long and exciting duet which follows, Leonora has a hard struggle for the life of the troubadour. Her first plea, "Slay me, but set him free," serves only to increase the fury of her rejected suitor. But he yields at last on her offering herself as the reward of his clemency. On condition that she marries the Count, she is to be allowed even to visit Manrico in his cell and be the bearer of his pardon. Leonora breaks into an ecstasy of rejoicing at this, and in the midst of her roulades finds opportunity to drain, unnoticed, the poison from the fatal ring. Scene 2. A dungeon in the tower of the castle. Azucena is lying on her wretched bed, but cannot sleep. Manrico tries to comfort her, but in vain. The gypsy already feels the hand of death upon her, and her only hope is that she may die before they come to drag her away to execution. Always before her eyes is the horror of the blazing pyre, and her mother's agony repeated. The fire motif is here introduced in the orchestra with admirable effect. She works herself up to a frenzy of terror, and sinks once more exhausted on the bed. Manrico takes his lute and soothes her to a calmer mood. Between walking and sleeping, she sees again in vision the hills of her native land, to which they both will surely soon return, and so she sinks to slumber. The music of the scene, Si la stanchezza and Ai nostri monti, in its touching pathos, gained by the simplest of means, is more than worthy to stand side by side with the Miserere music. Only it can hardly bear separation from its dramatic surroundings. Leonora enters, and the end follows swiftly. After the first rapture of meeting, her good tidings only awaken Manrico's suspicions. On what terms has she purchased his freedom? Guessing at only half the truth, he casts her from him with reproaches of her infidelity. But the poison has nearly finished its work, and Leonora sinks into the arms of her repentant lover. The Count enters, discovers how he has been tricked, and orders Manrico to instant execution. Azucena awakens to find Leonora dead and Manrico gone. She grasps the truth the moment for revelation has come, but it is too late. The Count drags Azucena to the grating of the cell to see Manrico already in his death agony. "See, yonder is thy son. Nay, thy own brother," is the terrible answer. With the cry, "Mother, thou art avenged," she sinks lifeless to the ground. The Count is left alone to bear the burden of the gypsy's curse.